it is a real honor for me and for all of us at Benchmark Books to have our special guest speaker and author with us tonight, Devery Anderson. Somebody asked me, when did it become Devery S. Anderson? We just call him Dev. But he was interviewed, I don't know if any of you caught it, but Doug Wright interviewed Devery, and that was broadcast this last Sunday on KSL Radio, just prior to the Mormon Tabernacle Choir broadcast on KSL. And that he did a great job talking about this new book. The book that so far I don't think is on the New York Times bestseller list, is it, Dev?
Check with me next week.
Yeah, check next week. Emmett Till, The Murder That Shocked the World and Propelled the Civil Rights Movement. I've just got to say that I'm really, really proud of Devery for doing this book. It's a fine book, and I'm just telling his daughter, Mandy or Amanda, depending on when you knew her and what she was going by. But we were just reminiscing a little bit because Devery used to work here. Well, I should say he was employed here about 20 years. That was supposed to be funny, you know, when he didn't work. That was 20 years ago we decided. Is that right, Dev?
Yep.
And Devery has always been a book lover and a lover of history. And I've got to hand it to him, and we were just talking that I never foresaw this, for Devery to produce a book like this that is getting national attention. We know that he's done a lot of things on Mormon history, including 3 volumes on the Joseph's Quorum of the Anointed, the Nauvoo Endowment Companies, and the development of LDS temple worship. He's done many, many articles. He's worked on the History of Dialogue magazine. He's just been very prolific, and I'm sure he's going to tell you about this, but this is many years in the making. Our faithful employee here, Brian Buchanan, was not homesick, but was homesick recently and finished the book. I haven't finished it yet, but really, really enjoyed it and speaks very highly of it. And I don't, Christopher, how do you say this name, Dev? Metras? Metras? This is what he says about Devery's book. No one knows more about this brutal murder and its contested legacy than Devery Anderson. In his long-anticipated and meticulously researched study, he has delivered, as we all expected, the definitive account of this case. Anderson has read every source, tracked every lead, assessed every claim, and weighed every piece of evidence in his passionate quest to know the truth. This is the Emmett Till book that historians have been waiting for, and it is the book that Emmett Till's legacy deserves. I can't top that. I'm going to turn the time over to Devery, but with just one quick aside, and this will undoubtedly be embarrassing to her, but it is Amanda's 30th birthday today, and we're going to sing Happy Birthday. So would you join me in singing Happy Birthday to Amanda?
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Amanda. Happy birthday to you.
And I heard that she said, if there was maybe an alternate plan for her birthday, that she said that this was an honor for her to be here for her dad on her birthday. I think that's really cool. By the way, even though technically we're supposed to give royalties to whoever owns the copyright of the birthday song, that's true. There really is a copyright and you're supposed to pay, but we're not going to. Instead, we're going to let Devery Anderson talk about his new book on Emmett Till. Thank you so much.
Testing. Does it pick up? Right, is that good?
Yeah.
Testing. 1, 2,
Do
3.
you hear him okay? No? Yes? You have no idea what I'm asking, right?
That's a good sign they don't hear me.
Talk like this, Dad.
Like this?
Yeah.
There you go.
I get a kink in my neck, but. All right, well, thank you for coming. Really great to see you here. Seeing some people I haven't seen in a long time tonight. Earlier, a roommate of mine was here from like a zillion years ago, and I hadn't seen him since we were roommates, and so that was really cool. And see so many others too. What time do I need to like stop? Just so I know?
About 9:30.
Okay.
Let's go for, see how it goes in about a half hour and then open it up to Q&A, but do you need more or
Okay.
less? Or
Oh,
do you need more than a half hour?
well, I could always go on for a lot longer than that.
Well,
but
let's
I'll
see how
take.
it
I
goes.
won't take more than that.
If I do this throat cutting sign, then you'll know it's time to wrap it up.
Of course, I've seen that from you directed towards me so many times.
So this time I mean it.
Okay. So thank you for being here. This has been an incredible journey as far as this book, writing this book, and since some of you I've known for a long time, other than other places where I've been speaking recently, how many of you remember me talking about this like for the last 20 years?
Yeah.
And how many of you are hoping I'm going to shut up now that the book is out? Okay, stop. I saw that too, John. Now it's like just beginning, you know, as far as me talking about this, because there's just so much to say, and now that it's out, and people have liked it so far. I'm proud of all that, and I'm happy with the reception. Some of you, I'm not sure if you know about the case, so I'm going to just spend a couple of moments just giving a brief overview about the Emmett Till murder, who Emmett Till was, and why this case is important. Emmett Till was, in 1955 is when this happened. He was 14 years old in 1955. He was from Chicago, born and raised there, didn't know much about the South at all. But in the summer of 1955, he spent the last 2 weeks of his vacation. He and a cousin named Wheeler Parker took a train together along with their uncle Moses Wright. The last 2 weeks of summer break, we're going to spend it with the Wrights and then come back to Chicago 2 weeks later. This is on August 24th, or August 20th, 1955. They arrive in Mississippi. It's the beginning of cotton picking time, and so they spend a few days picking cotton during the day. On the Wednesday, August 24th, after picking cotton for half a day, 8 kids, counting Wheeler, Parker, Simeon Wright, other brothers of Simeon, some cousins, and a couple of neighbors, piled into Moses Wright's car. They drove 3 miles into the downtown area of Money, Mississippi, and I know a few people who've been to Money. John's been there just recently. Not a lot. And back then there were, on that main street in Money, there were like 3 or 4 stores, a juke joint, cafe, post office, and a cotton gin. One of those stores was the Bryant Grocery and Meat Market. And it catered to black field hands who would go in and buy their supplies on credit. They would pay up at the end of the year after cotton harvest when they got paid. So these types of stores were all over in the Delta. And working behind the counter at the Bryant Grocery was a young woman named Carolyn Bryant. She was 21 years old, married to the store's owner. The kids went in to buy refreshments. Emmett Till went in and bought a couple of cents worth of bubble gum. And he was in the store alone briefly with Carolyn Bryant. He had a very fun-loving personality. He would crack jokes. He would, you know, he's the kind of kid that, one of his cousins told me, he was the kind of kid that would pull the fire alarm in school and did that on occasion. He would pay people to tell jokes to him. He was always wanting to be the center of attention. He would play pranks and that. Always good-natured about it. He wasn't malicious or anything like that. But on this occasion, probably to show off to his friends who were waiting outside and peeking into the window of the store, there was some banter about girls outside the store, and one of the kids said, "There's a pretty girl inside the store, you ought to go in and take a look at her." So he went in the store. That's when he bought his gum. Not sure what happened inside the store, but because he was alone with her for a little bit, but when he left the store, she followed him out. And after he got out of the store, he waved and said, "Bye," instead of goodbye, ma'am. And a black kid at the time from the South would have never really looked a white woman in the eye and said anything other than yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, answered questions, things like that. And so he waved and said bye, and she got upset about that, so she started walking towards her car, and when she started walking, he whistled at her, just did a wolf whistle, you know, when you see like some people do when they see a pretty girl. Construction workers, if you're any here, maybe you've done that yourself. And so that moment scared everybody, all the kids who were there with him, because they saw that a taboo had been broken, something that he didn't really recognize as being anything wrong. He was from the North. And so all the kids got in the car, took off. Didn't think much more about it for about 3 days, but this was on a Wednesday. On Saturday night, or Sunday morning, about 2 o'clock in the morning, some men pounded on Moses Wright's door. One of them said, "This is Mr. Bryant. I want to talk with you and this boy from Chicago." So when Moses Wright opened the door, he saw 2 men standing there with one man had a flashlight in one hand and a gun in the other. And there was a third man behind these 2 that was covering his face, and Moses Wright thought he was covering his face so that he wouldn't recognize him, like perhaps Moses Wright knew him, and so he thought he may have been a black man. And so they barged in, took a few moments going from room to room to find the boy they were after. There were 6 kids there that night, 2 boys per room, per bed. Went through until he found Emmett Till, made him get up, put his clothes on, put his shoes on, took him outside, and Moses Wright followed them out, and he heard them on the outside. It was so dark he couldn't make out even what kind of car it was, if it was a car or a truck. That's how pitch black it was outside. But Moses Wright heard one of the men ask somebody in the car, "Is this the right boy?" And the response was a voice that sounded like a woman's voice, and Moses Wright heard them say, "Yes, it is." And so with that, they put him in the car and drove off. Moses Wright and his wife was so scared after that she demanded that Mose take her to her brother's home 30 miles away in Sumner. She never set foot in Money, Mississippi again after that night. Never came back to get her clothes or belongings, anything. That's how scared she was. So 3 days later, on the 31st, on a Wednesday, a fisherman, a young 17-year-old fisherman, was out in the Tallahatchie River, and he noticed in the distance a pair of knees sticking up out of the water. He called the police and his dad. Some men came in a boat and got the body, saw that there was a young black man. He was tethered to a cotton gin fan that was meant to weigh him down. The fan weighed about 75 pounds, and he was weighed down with this, but he didn't sink all the way, or at least over time, over a few days, surfaced a little bit. And they called Emmett's relatives. They identified him. Moses Wright identified him as his nephew. All he could go by was a ring that was on Emmett's finger that had his father's initials. And because it had been a gift to Emmett from his father after he died, his mother passed that on to Emmett. That's how they were able to identify him. He was so badly beaten and mutilated, and with the decomposition of being 3 days in the river, it was almost impossible to recognize him. His mother insisted they send the body back to Chicago, although officials there tried to bury him a few hours later in Money, but the police and another uncle intervened, sent his body up north. His mother, when she identified him, said, "I can never explain what they did to my son. People have to see it," and so she insisted on an open casket funeral. And when she did that, his body was on display for 5 days up in Chicago, and when she put his body on display, that got national attention to the case. And national attention continued because a few weeks later, Milam and Bryant, J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant were the 2 men that were arrested, put on trial in September, and after 5 days, an all-white jury in Tallahatchie County acquitted the men despite all of the evidence. So these men got away with murder. And a few months after this, a reporter sold a story to Look magazine. He got the idea, as the reporter was William Bradford Huey, he got the idea that for enough money these men would talk and tell what really happened. They weren't in danger of being tried again. So William Bradford Huey interviewed these men in the office of one of their defense attorneys, and they told the whole story, although they lied a lot in the sense that they were accomplices to the murder. They were seen with other people, other white men and other black men, who they had kind of forced to help out. But they didn't mention any of these people in their story, but for $3,150 they sold their story, which today that would be worth, I don't know, 40-some thousand dollars, and told and admitted that they kidnapped and murdered Emmett Till. So Emmett Till's mother had to endure the pain of losing her child. She had to endure the acquittal as a result of the trial, and then she had to endure these men profiting off of the death of her son and telling this story, and none of them ever expressed any remorse about the murder ever after. I learned about this case in the fall of 1994 after he just moved to Utah. I was just starting at the University of Utah. I went to the library one day, just got my library card, and I checked out of the library this PBS series. Back then it was on videotape, but it was called Eyes on the Prize. And I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a 6-part history of the civil rights movement. The very first episode is one called Awakenings, and the first 15-minute segment is about the Emmett Till case, and that's where I got my introduction to this. And it's interesting, it's kind of an aside, but I think it's significant. This, I don't know if you can tell, this is autographed by Julian Bond. I saw him a couple years ago when I led a tour of the Till sites for him in the South, and he autographed this. Julian Bond narrated this series. And then in 2012 he contacted me to see if I would be interested in leading this tour, and I did, and then he, to reciprocate, he agreed to write the foreword to my book, which he did, and then he died suddenly just as the book came out last. He died a month ago, almost exactly, which was really hard for me. But it's interesting because he introduced me, when I saw him, he introduced me twice to people who I thought were very significant civil rights legends. One was Merle Evers, the widow of Medgar Evers, and when he introduced me to her, he introduced me to Jesse Jackson a few months after that, and both times he said, "I want you to meet Devery Anderson. He knows more about Emmett Till than Emmett Till's mother." And maybe I know more about the case and all the details like that, but I'm sure she knew Emmett much more than me. But I thought that was significant because I received my introduction to Emmett Till by Julian Bond, and then, 19 or so years later, 18 years later, he's contacting me and having me go around, and then he's introducing me as someone who knows, more about the case than he did. And so to me, that's significant and something that means a lot, that we kind of went full circle on that one. But when I learned about the case, I couldn't get it out of my mind because of the very things I just mentioned. These men got away with murder. And in the footage of the trial, you see them smiling and hugging their wives, and they seem so happy after this acquittal. And I was so furious about that. I thought, this just isn't right, and I have to find out what happened to these guys. Did they prosper? And what happened to Emmett Till's mother? I didn't know, because I'd never heard of the case. I didn't know if she was still alive, if she had died in obscurity somewhere and just lived the rest of her life alone. This was her only child. I had so many questions that I immediately set out to find out what I could. And back then, there were only a couple of books out on the case, and neither one of them were very good. One had just come out, and the one that had been out for a few years wasn't all that satisfying to me. And so I went around every time I was in a bookstore or a library. If I went to see a book, I would search out books on the civil rights movement or on black history. I'd always go straight to the index to see what it had to say about Emmett Till. And sometimes there was nothing. Sometimes there'd be something just in passing. Sometimes they would treat it with some significance, but very often not. And I knew the case was so significant to the civil rights movement, but yet people weren't talking about it. And that was frustrating. A couple years later, as I was still trying to read everything I could find, I took a class on American racism at the University of Utah, and for our final class project for the semester, the teacher said, come up with something good and present it to the class, to everybody. And I thought about it, and I thought, I would love it. At this point, I'd learned that Emmett Till's mother was still living. And I thought, I would love it if I could get a hold of her and interview her. And so I went to this is before the internet, at least before I had it anyway, and I went to the library and picked a Chicago phone book off the shelf, and I looked up and saw that she was listed in the phone book. And so I was too nervous to call her because I didn't know what the reaction would be, if she would be, if she was tired of people calling her, if she was just kind of angry or what. I knew nothing. And so I thought I would write her. And so I wrote her, and she didn't respond. The assignment was due like on December 3rd, and it was, getting past Thanksgiving, and then end of the month, and December 1st rolls around, and so I thought I better call her because this is due in 2 days and I have nothing else I could possibly do my assignment on at this point. So I called her up, and she put me at ease right away with the tone in her voice, and I was really, right away, I thought, oh, this is great, why didn't I do this sooner? So I asked her if I could interview her, and she said, yeah, that would be fine. And I said, not tonight, because I know I'm just catching you just spur of the moment, and I want to give you time. And she said, that's fine, you can call back tomorrow. Called back the next day, and she didn't answer. And turns out she was at a funeral, and I called her, got a hold of her, and she said, well, today's been bad, I forgot about this funeral, call me tomorrow. Well, that was the day the assignment was due. So I said, okay, it's a night class, I can transcribe the interview during the day. So I called her in the morning, she didn't answer again, and so I started saying big F, in front of me for failing this class. So I kept trying, got a hold of her, she had been out, apologized, said she could spare me 45 minutes, and we ended up talking for a couple of hours. And she did most of the talking. I was trying to get off at that point because I had to start working on my assignment. She wouldn't let me go. She was so happy to talk to me about Emmett. And so that conversation on December 3rd, 1996 began a friendship that lasted with her until she died in 2003, in January of 2003. And our last conversation, she told me that a documentary had just been made, was going to be at Sundance in Salt Lake City. And I said, maybe I can finally meet you in person. And I said, I will call the filmmaker and see if we can get you out here. And she said, that would be great. And so I got a hold of Stanley Nelson, who was the producer of this, and told him, and he said, well, let's see what we can do to get her out. But then sadly, she died suddenly that week. She had a heart attack and died. But that didn't end and I didn't know where I was going with this, but I was so passionate about the case, and I was still learning and still trying to find out, still spreading the word about the Emmett Till case to other people. In May of 2004, the federal government, as a result of this documentary and another that had come out, and that came out later, called The Untold Story of Emmett Lewis Till by a different filmmaker, these two films produced evidence that there were other people involved in the murder besides Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam. And so the federal government reopened the case in 2004 as a result of this. They thought it would be worth the time and money to see if there were accomplices still living. And just about 6 months after they opened the investigation, I decided it's time that I wrote a book about this, because I wasn't happy with stuff that had come out. Even Emmett Till's mother's memoir came out about 9 months after she died, and it was from her perspective, which was important, but it didn't tell the case in full, and it certainly had a mother's bias in it. And I thought something deeply researched that would go over all of the details just needed to happen. It was time. So I began doing this, and I began making trips to Mississippi as a result of that. Went to Mississippi for the first time in February of 2005 and made about 14 or 15 trips since then to Mississippi and Chicago. I interviewed cousins who were with Emmett Till when he whistled at Carolyn Bryant in the store, cousins who were with him when he was kidnapped, who remember seeing the gunman who come into the home, and one of them, he said the gunman put the gun in his face, thinking he may have been the right boy at first. And I interviewed one young man, well, he was 18 at the time, he was in his late 60s when I interviewed him in 2007. He was the one who was walking by the shed the morning Emmett Till was murdered and heard him being beaten to death in this shed. And so he was the one person who was able to place the murder where it happened, in Sunflower County, not actually in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, where the trial happened. So I was able to conduct a lot of interviews. I interviewed a lot of reporters who covered the trial that were still alive and still lucid, and who were in their early 20s at the time. So some of them were in their 70s and 80s when I interviewed them, but they remember vividly the trial and were able to tell me a lot to enhance the story and my research. And so the book took about 10 years to research and write. I turned in the manuscript last fall, so it was almost exactly 10 years of research and writing, and then spent several months going through, making all the corrections, doing all that stuff, and then the book just came out about a month ago. What the book has to offer that I think other books about the case don't offer, don't even attempt to offer, is first of all the telling of the whole story. There were so many details that I think were stranger than fiction, and I hope I brought those out in the book. Just the accomplices to Milam and Bryant, identifying those, and there had always been talk about some of them. I didn't discover who these people were, but I think I was able to put what their involvement was, who was and who wasn't. There were so many names that were associated with the killing over the years. So I think I was able to do that. Other books that had come out focused on certain aspects of the case because they were more academic. Several dissertations and published works, for whatever reason, thought, and this is important, but so many of them thought it was important to talk about and analyze the media coverage of the case, because the northern press had a different take than the southern press. The black press and the white press, they all viewed it differently, and their reporting was different. So a lot of studies have focused on that over the years. There have been a few memoirs, but nobody had attempted really to do what I did, and I couldn't really figure out why. The story was just so important, and nobody had taken the time really to provide all the detail. The challenge when you provide that much detail is to not get bogged down in boring things, and I found myself cutting stuff a lot and trying to improve the flow of the book. And I think I succeeded, although a couple times I had to kind of stop to analyze certain things. The most important one was what happened at the store when Emmett Till whistled, because his mother, who wasn't there, told a version that Emmett Till, that her son simply was whistling to. He had polio when he was a child, and he had a speech impediment as a result of that. And she said that whenever he got stuck on a word, she told him to just whistle to try to blow the word out. And when I looked at her earliest speeches in the 50s, she never mentions that. And I think that was something she came to kind of believe herself over the years. And if you've done studies of memory, memory can be shaped by sometimes what you want to believe, or what you hear from other people. What you see on television suddenly becomes your own personal experience in that. So I had to go in there and really look and see. There are so many contradictory stories about what happened at the store. And I see so many people, when they talk about the case, they'll say Emmett Till allegedly whistled at Carolyn Bryant, or he may have been, his mother said he may have been just trying to help his stutter along and things like that. And I've seen people echo what she said and what others have said, and I'm like, no, this isn't what happened. And you can easily tell what happened by going back to the earliest sources. These very cousins, who today sometimes remember things differently, see what they said 50, 60 years ago. It was 50 years when I started the book. It was now 60 years ago that all this happened. And so that's what I tried to do. And I provide the documentation, so I'm hoping now that a lot of the stuff, a lot of the details that have been, where falsehoods have been perpetuated over the years, can finally be laid to rest. And I wanted to do that. And I wanted to create like a one-stop shop, really, for anything Emmett Till. And I know others will build on this later, and I hope they do, and I know there's more to be said. But that's really what I wanted to do on this. And I think it succeeded pretty well. One of the things I wanted to do, too, and it was a challenge because I include a chapter 10, that talks about what happens to everybody in the years after the trial. And that was a challenge because I didn't know if people would be all that interested in a lot of these people. But I was hoping that by the time they read the book, that they would feel such a part of the story that they would be curious, like what happened to Carolyn Bryant and what happened to Milam and Bryant and the sheriffs that were involved. One was a very racist sheriff, and the defense attorneys and all these people. I thought, I'm going to take a chance and put all this in here, and if people get bored, that's just a chance I'm going to take. And so far I've had good responses about that. People seem, by the time they get to that chapter, they're like, yeah, I was curious, what happened to these people? So I had to really dig. It was a challenge to get anybody from the side of Milam and Bryant to talk to me. But I actually got a few. One, J.W. Milam's wife died, his widow, well, Milam died in 1980 of cancer. Roy Bryant died in 1994, just a few weeks before I started looking, before I heard of this case. And, but Juanita Milam just died in 2014. And after she died, one of her relatives, who I'd been trying to talk into letting me interview her over the years, or for at least a year or so, maybe before her grandmother's, I just gave it away, before her relative's death, said, she ignored all my requests, but after Juanita Milam died, she responded and said, I'll talk to you now. I just wanted this person to have their last years to be able to live in peace without anyone harassing her. And So after Juanita's death, I found out a lot more about J.W. Milam, his background, his family, what his life was like after the trial. And with Carolyn Bryant, who is still alive, living in Raleigh, North Carolina, I was able to get someone to talk to me who knows her better than anybody on the planet, certainly longer than anybody has known her. And this person has had requests over the years for interviews. She always turned them down. I just saw this person 2 weeks ago and asked this person if that was the case, and this person said, yes, but you're the only one I've ever granted an interview with about Carolyn. And so I gained this person's trust through a mutual friend, and it took a while. This person interviewed the mutual friend interviewed this person a couple of times for me, and then last spring the source allowed me to meet up with her, and we had an interview, and then we just had dinner a couple of weeks ago. And so I was able to find out information about the people, and I was able to dig, and I don't think anybody else has ever been able to do anything like that, and so that's a major contribution to the book, I think. And it kind of humanizes Carolyn Bryant somewhat. People over the years have really seen her as the one that we need to go after, because she's the one living person that people can kind of put all their hatred on and try to get some justice. But you only want to do that if there's a reason to. You know, if she's guilty of something, then yes, you know, she needs to be tried. You know, if there's any evidence regarding her involvement in the murder. The FBI concluded in 2007 that manslaughter, based on precedent, you don't have to be present during killing to be charged with manslaughter, but if you aided the killers in some way, you can be charged with manslaughter. And there are a couple of cases that they cited, and the Moses writes testimony that Carolyn Bryant identified Emmett Till as the one who whistled. They used that, and a couple other people came forward and said, well, that same day they kidnapped me too, because they thought maybe I was Emmett Till, and they threw me in the back of this truck, and one guy said he chipped a tooth because when Carolyn said, no, that's not the right one, they threw him back out of the truck, and he landed on his face, and he chipped a tooth. This person said Carolyn Bryant was present. And so we have this late testimony from people saying that she was there. We have Mose Wright's testimony saying he heard a voice that sounded like a woman's voice. That was, I think, pretty much what the FBI used, turned that over to the state of Mississippi in 2007. The district attorney held a grand jury, but the grand jury said there wasn't enough evidence, so there was no indictment. So that was the result of the FBI investigation. But the nice thing about the investigation, it was not a waste of time, because they exhumed Emmett Till's body in 2005 to find out, first of all, if it was really him in the grave, because the defense in 1995, one of their theories was that the body wasn't even Emmett Till. He was so badly decomposed and beaten that nobody could recognize him. Well, nowadays, of course, you can prove those things through DNA, and that's what they did. They also discovered many more injuries to him. His wrists were broken. There were more injuries to the head were worse than they thought. So they were able to find that out, and plus they found the trial transcript, which had been missing for 50 years. And I was able to use the transcript of the trial in my book, obviously very important, and suddenly it was to read these people's words after having spent so much time. I felt I knew these people, and suddenly here they were. It was like they were back from the dead as I was reading their words in the trial transcript. That aided my book tremendously. So the book has a lot to offer that other books weren't able to do. When I started this book, the FBI investigation had just started, and I knew the final chapters, the outcome, was yet to be determined. And so I didn't even know how the book was going to end myself. And so that ended in 2007. And so had I written this book any earlier than that, I wouldn't have benefited from the FBI. So there's a lot in the book in that sense. And also, time and perspective, I think, is what you need in a book like this. People didn't recognize the importance of the case to the civil rights movement early on, obviously, because the movement was just getting going. And even in the decades after the murder, artists and others Bob Dylan and others, a lot of poets, a lot of fiction was written loosely based on the Till case, but historians weren't saying much for a long time. But for whatever reason, after the 30th anniversary of the murder in 1985, it started, this new interest emerged. That's when Emmett's mother began speaking really publicly outside of just Chicago circles and on the national stage, really for the first time since the trial and the months after that. But to tie it into the civil rights movement, it's interesting, and I'm going to just read something here, then I guess it's going to be time to close. President Eisenhower was president at the time. He had one black man in his, not the cabinet, but he was part of the White House staff. His name was E. Frederick Morrow. He was the only black member of the staff, and he said he was often, at formal events, he was often mistaken as a servant and not part of the staff because he was black and nobody was used to seeing a black man in that capacity before. But because he was black, he received a lot of mail from people all over the world saying, what is President Eisenhower going to do about this? Because after the acquittal of Milam and Bryant, there was pressure. Thousands and thousands of letters came in to the Justice Department and to J. Edgar Hoover saying the federal government needs to intervene and step in on this case because it was so unjust. The sheriff was racist, the sheriff aided the defense, all this stuff. But really nobody listened. There was a brief investigation by the FBI back then. It just lasted a few days and it was over. So E. Frederick Morrow was feeling a lot of pressure, and he was very depressed about this case and about the lack of response from the administration. Let me read this here. He said, as a member of the White House, and this is a letter he wrote to another official during this time. He said, as a member of the White House staff, I am sitting in the middle of this, and I have been accused of being cowardly for not bringing the situation to the attention of the administration and requesting the president to make some kind of observation on this unwholesome problem. My mail has been heavy and angry, and wherever I go, people have expressed disappointment that no word has come from the White House deploring the situation. I always point out, of course, that our Attorney General has followed this situation with interest and skill, and that he will act when and if federal laws are violated. But this does not still the protestations. There is a clamor for some kind of statement from the White House that will indicate the administration is aware of and condemns with vigor any kind of racist activity in the United States. He mentioned also that these protest rallies that erupted all over the nation and even across the sea in Paris, the Vatican even responded to this murder in their unofficial newspaper. And he said that, I'll just read a couple of paragraphs here that I wrote. Some of this is my own writing and some is, I'll quote here. It said, Morrow suggested that Vice President Nixon invite several black leaders to Washington to talk together about the problem and to do it, quote, intelligently and dispassionately, end quote. It would reassure the black community that the administration was concerned while also putting racists on alert that their, quote, un-American tactics, end quote, would result in prosecution by the Attorney General. Morrow also noted that thousands still attended large rallies all over the country protesting the Till murder, and that the case was, quote, the subject of numerous Sunday sermons in the pulpits of the land, end quote. And unbeknownst to Morrow, one of the most significant of those Sunday gatherings had occurred just 2 days earlier. 2 days earlier was November 27th, 1955. In Montgomery, Alabama, a rally was held at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. The minister there was a young man by the name of Martin Luther King Jr., who had just taken over the church the previous year. Dr. T.R.M. Howard was, at the time, Mississippi's most prominent black civil rights activist. He gave a very powerful speech that night about the Till case and another recent shooting that had just happened days earlier, an attempted murder of the NAACP leader in Belzoni. And he gave all these horrific details about Emmett Till. Not only was Martin Luther King present, he gave the invocation and the benediction that night. He listened to this, but also in the audience was a seamstress by the name of Rosa Parks. And it was 4 days after this powerful speech that she refused to give up her seat on a bus, and the civil rights movement was born. And if you understand the large rallies as a result of the Till case that erupted everywhere, the situation was just ripe for Rosa Parks to take her stand. And although there had been some legal victories with the Brown decision, Brown versus Board of Education, that just days earlier, months earlier, and there were legal victories, this grassroots movement needed a push. People needed to realize at the grassroots level was where the change was going to come. And as a result of the atmosphere of the Till case is when Rosa Parks took her stand by sitting. And of course, we know what happened from there. And so that's part of the tie-in, really, for the Till case. And the reason it didn't get as much attention in the years after is because it was so horrific. And nothing directly as a result of the Till case. There was no justice for those killers. People focused on the triumphs of the civil rights movement, even though there was more bloodshed and more sacrifice yet to come. That's one of the reasons it took historians so long to see the importance of Emmett Till. And so that's what I hope the book does in large measure. Thank you.